Hello, my name is Ian Bent and I'm a member of the Mill Road History Society. The topic of this presentation is a small, unassuming, but nonetheless interesting side street off Mill Road. I'll be drawing on research done by my wife Caroline and myself, and also that by Alan Brigham. If you walk down Mill Road from Parker's Piece heading out of town, the second turning on the right after the first parade of shops is Covent Garden. It's only 200 metres in length and ends in a cul-de-sac, although two turn-offs to the left mean that it does have through traffic. Here you see the street on a bright summer morning with the Six Bells pub on the left and at the very far end what is known as the Drama Studio, about both of which more later. The street is a mixture of business and residential, with a bias these days towards residential accommodation. Of the 41 houses, 5 are council houses. The remainder divide between owner-occupied, with many long-term residents, and rentals. The present population is a cross-section of ages, from tiny babies to people in their 80s, with a cohort of small children who bring life to the street. The earliest buildings date back to the late 1830s. The most recent are from 2008. Covent Garden has the distinction of being the oldest side street on Mill Road. The name first appears as early as 1823. A newspaper advert announcing the sale of land, as you can see here in the middle of the screen, valuable parcels of building ground in 60 lots, 6 of them 22 feet, and 2 of them 36 feet frontage, and all 100 foot deep. Only 2 years go by and a house is already for sale. Sounds quite luxurious. Contains 2 front parlours, good kitchen behind and cellar, and 2 pleasant bedrooms over the same with large landing. And there's a good garden, pump, etc. behind the house. The most frequently asked question is, why is it called Covent Garden? To which we don't have a definitive answer. This map, made in 1830, shows Covent Garden running down the centre with an orchard to the east and a garden to the west. You can even see garden paths with flower beds and a few trees. And of course, the mill at the top, which gave Mill Road its name. Covent Garden itself is flanked with gardens of various shapes and sizes, with a tiny handful of buildings, none of which survive today. It's possible the street could have been named after the London Covent Garden, which received its name in the 16th century. Or perhaps it was land owned by the nunnery, or convent, of St. Radegund, now Jesus College. Earlier I said Covent Garden was the first side street, and this panoramic view of Mill Road from the same map, running from East Road on the left to what is now Cutlax, demonstrates that. Covent Garden is like an oasis surrounded by open fields. To the west is the town jail, then new, and to the east is the Mill Road Nursery and Polecat Farm, at which point Mill Road narrowed down to a footpath leading over to Cherry Hinton. This map was made in 1908, but aims to portray things as they were in 1835. It shows the same features as the 1830 map, but with the names of some of the owners. Matthew Seymour, whose grave is in Mill Road Cemetery, and Joseph Pledger. The houses in this terrace on the east side of the cul-de-sac are the oldest surviving in the street. 4 of them were built in 1838 and the nearest 2 in 1841. Simple early Victorian cottages, originally with 2 rooms upstairs and 2 down, no kitchen, no bathroom or sanitation. And from the early 1840s are these houses on the opposite side of the cul-de-sac, somewhat larger than the first terrace. The wisteria on the walls there is spectacular in late spring, and draws flocks of people to see it every year. But just look at this. This is the 1841 census report for Covent Garden, with 46 residents' names on just this one sheet alone, and this is only the first of 2.5 sheets. 112 people in all are listed, making up 22 households. Probably many of them living in wooden structures and others in a few crowded houses. What sorts of people were these? Interestingly, of the 27 men who declared an occupation, only a few were unskilled labourers or domestic servants. The great majority were tradesmen such as carpenters, blacksmiths, tailors, brewers, and even one printer. So it was mainly an artisan community. And some of the women are identified as dressmakers. Notably, 2 of the men were publicans, and one of those was our garden owner, Joseph Pledger, who had a beer house on the street. But of particular interest is the other publican, with the glorious name of Israel Haggis. The history of the Six Bells public house goes back to 1838. We can't be certain that the present building was what was there in 1838, but it's certainly old. The earliest owner of the pub was John Eden, with an A in the name, doubtless a precursor of the Eden family of Cambridge's department store, Eden Lily. And the first publican was our friend Israel Haggis. There's a nice story about Israel. On the 1841 census, he's aged 25, and he's listed with his 20-year-old wife, Sarah, and a male and a female servant. 2 years later, his male servant was one Alfred Hutt. And on the 9th of November, 1843, Sarah eloped with Alfred, taking money and property belonging to her husband, and went to live in Hammersmith under an unassumed name. Israel tracked down the Hammersmith house and found in it many articles belonging to him. Eventually, Alfred was brought to court in Cambridge on the strange charge of larceny by an adulterer. On the stand, Israel said, "My wife, I'm sorry to say, has not for these last 3 years been of sober habits." The jury declared Alfred not guilty. And after that, Israel quit the Six Bells and moved to Parker's Piece, where he opened a cricketing hotel and tavern, from which he sold cricket gear as a sideline. This image is part of a map produced in 1858 by the borough surveyor Richard Reynolds Rowe, showing principally the drainage and sewerage systems of Cambridge. Unlike normal maps, it doesn't show the whole of buildings, just their frontages, and it ignores gardens and parks. Buildings, shaded pink, are made of brick or stone. Those in grey are wooden or other structures. The east side, the lower side in this picture, shows clusters of buildings interspersed with open spaces and wooden structures. The west side, the upper side, shows very little building, only a cluster of 3 houses in the middle, 2 more further down, and 4 in the cul-de-sac. About 24 buildings in all. Directly below the G of garden is the Six Bells, and beside it on the left are 2 wooden structures, cowsheds, a dairy owned at that time by one James Cave. Now compare that with this image from the Ordnance Survey map of 30 years later, 1888. What an enormous difference. First, Covent Garden has sprouted 2 side streets, Mill Street and Cross Street. These were laid out in 1866, so only 8 years after the Rowe map. Secondly, the street is now lined from end to end on both sides with pink-shaded brick buildings, leaving only Pledger's Garden at the top northernmost corner. When did all of this happen? This transformation began in the late 1860s and was completed in 1891, just after this map, with the building of 3 terraces on the west side of the street. Incidentally, if you look at the N in Covent, let your eye slide down to the two cottages below it, cottages that were demolished in the 1960s. In the left hand of the two, in the mid-1870s, there lived a tailor by the name of Frederick William Scrivener. He was part of Covent Garden's cottage industry. That's to say, the house was his workshop. Scrivener had an assistant by the name of Robert Browning. At the end of the day, on 28th of August, 1876, Browning left his workplace and walked across town to Fair Street, where he had a pint of beer, and then to the Four Lanterns Junction on Jesus Lane, looking for a prostitute. From then on, the story is well known. He met 16-year-old Emma Rolfe, took her to Midsummer Common, slit her throat with a razor, gave himself up to the police, and on the 15th of December was hanged in the town jail. The story made the national newspapers, and no fewer than 2,000 onlookers attended Emma's funeral in Mill Road Cemetery. But now, back to those three terraces. Here you see Pledger's Garden at the top end of the road, divided into building plots by the auctioneers. 14 lots in all, 5 facing onto Mill Road, numbers 1 to 5, and 9 onto Covent Garden, numbered 6 to 14. Of the latter, 8 are sold, and within a few years, a terrace of 8 houses has been built, with shallow front gardens and longer back gardens. The houses may look uniform, but in fact they were built in groups of 1 or 2, quite possibly by different builders. And incidentally, the bay windows at the nearest 2 weren't added until the late 20th century. Even before that terrace was built, another one had been erected in the middle of the west side. It must have been built at the end of the 1860s, for the houses were all occupied by 1871. Set back from the road by 10 feet or so, with cultivated front gardens and uniform in architecture, this is perhaps the prettiest of the terraces on the street. This is the third and last of those 3 wide west side terraces. The first 4 houses were built in the late 1880s and were known as the Hicks houses, from the builder James Hicks, who has a very handsome grave in Mill Road Cemetery. The 5th and final house was built in 1891. They quickly became tied houses for the borough police. That's to say, their occupants, right through to World War II, were constables, sergeants, and inspectors. And here's one of the stalwarts of the police force, Moses Free, who served in the force from 1890 to 1920, rising from constable to sergeant and then to police inspector. He lived at number 50, the furthest away of the 5 houses, from 1895 to his death in 1940, and his daughter lived on there for several decades after that. At the far end of the street, facing up towards Mill Road, is a building which has changed functions several times in its 100+ years. Built in 1906, originally as an outpost of St. Barnabas Church, it served first as a drill hall for the Boys Brigade and as the infants department of St. Barnabas School. It continued thus until 1925, in which year it was taken over as a private school, St. Margaret's School for Girls, which flourished until the mid-1950s. Thereafter, local residents fought off a city council plan to replace it with a block of flats. The building survived, becoming a highly successful drama studio for many local groups, which eventually moved to the Junction on the cattle market site. And since the mid-1990s, it's been leased to Anglia Ruskin University as its dance and drama studio. From 1900 on, Covent Garden saw major changes. We might almost speak of its industrialization. From 1869, this house had been run as a bakery and confectionery and had an unbroken history of 140 years as a bakery, finally closing only in 2011. Back in 1901, the firm of Tyler and Sons, bakers in St Andrews since 1857, acquired the house and moved their base of operations to Covent Garden. Within a few years, they were supplying bread to most of the university's colleges and many restaurants. In 1945, they expanded their premises round the corner into Mill Street. As one informant commented, "The bakery was in use 24 hours a day. The baker baked all night, and then the confectioners started in the day. The ovens had to be kept burning all the time or they would crack. The noise from them was terrific, and residents of the first 3 houses on Mill Street felt vibration all night long." Add to the noise and vibration the deliveries of materials and the constant flow of vans picking up the finished articles. In 1907, the Cherry Hinton Road butchers A.E. Page acquired the northwest corner site of Covent Garden and Mill Road, remaining there until 1956. In 1922, the firm decided to make its pork pies and sausages and other products on site, so gained permission to build a sausage factory behind the shop. These are the designs. Downstairs, the pork was cured. Upstairs was the bakery with ovens, where the cases for pork pies and pastry for sausage rolls were made. The 4 wooden doors below allowed lorries to deliver the materials, and through the overhead pair of doors above, the finished products were winched down to waiting vans for deliveries. In the 1990s, the shop became Barney's clothing store, popular all over Cambridge, and the sausage factory became its warehouse, until eventually being turned into small flats. Add to all this that since 1883, Covent Garden had a slaughterhouse on its east side, just north of Cross Street, where Cambridge Econometrics stands today. Owned by Sennett the Butchers of Pease Hill, it lasted for nearly 100 years. Can you imagine the noises and smells that came out of that place and what it must have been like to live in a house nearby? Put all of this together and the Covent Garden of the 1930s was a hugely busy commercial place with lorries and vans coming and going, cattle being herded down the street, and sheep and other animals delivered for slaughter. In 2020, Covent Garden is somewhat quieter than that, more of a residential community. Nowadays, it serves as a cut-through for taxis and over large delivery vehicles between Mill Road and Hills Road and the station. Commercial enterprises there still are. We have a mortgage broker, a landscape designer, an architect's practice, where those cowsheds once stood, and an expert in data analysis and economic modelling on the slaughterhouse side. But none of them, mercifully, emits rancid smells or loud noises. There are only 2 post-World War II buildings. That which now houses Cambridge Econometrics was built in 1985 by a local builder, Reuben Slingsby, hence its name, Reuben House. Slingsby's occupied several sites in Covent Garden between 1930 and the 80s, then went bust in the late 80s. Econometrics was a spin-off from the university's economics department. The other one is an award-winning pair of energy-efficient houses by local architect Nicholas Ray, whose studio is on the street, in 2008. These houses are on the site of that pair of cottages demolished in the 1960s. If you recall the tailor Frederick Scrivener and his murderous assistant, this is the replacement for that pair of cottages, and it was from the right hand of the original pair that Robert Browning set out that night. I hope you've enjoyed this survey of Mill Road's earliest side street. In the interests of time and simplicity, I've had to leave out many other houses, past and present, not least the former Sally Ann charity shop on the northeast corner. But for the latter, you can read the Society's report on the history of that building by clicking the first link here. If you'd like to see the work of Mill Road History Society displayed on the web, do click on the second link here. And if you'd like to subscribe to the Society's newsletter and receive notifications of its events, click on the third link.